So tonight, no pictures, no gimmicks, just a little bit of storytelling. Some of you may have heard some of these stories before. Some of you may have read them in my books. Some of the stories are in my books and some of the stories are in my head. And I thought I would start, oftentimes I start talking about my own house here in Helena, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. What I'd like to talk about first is the first story that really got me started in collecting this type of, can we call it literature? I don't know. Events or whatever you might want to call it. I have been working at the Montana Historical Society since 1992 and began my job here as National Register Sign Coordinator. And so many of you know that, those signs that you read around town, many of them have been written by me. And most of them have been written by me. And it has really afforded me this very unique opportunity to look at properties and places in ways that people don't usually have an opportunity to view them. Because when you have 5 little houses all in a row, you have to come up with a 200-word text about each one. You get pretty good at researching places and finding dirt on places, and little things that are interesting about each one individually. And so after about 3 or 4 years, I had gotten pretty good at doing that. And one day I got a phone call from Tim Gordon. Some of you may know him, who at that time lived in Virginia City. And he called me and said, I'd like to have a sign for my little house that I've just bought in Virginia City. Nobody's ever looked at really the early history of it. I don't know who built it or anything about it. But he said, it's part of the district, the historic district. I'd really like to have a sign for it. But he said, this is going to be a rental. And he said, I'd really like to know if there's any truth to a story about this house. And he proceeded to tell me that the former resident was a lady by the name of Lucille Dixon. Lucille Dixon was an old-time resident there in Virginia City, had lived in the house for probably 30 years. And she went around, and for everybody who would listen to her, she would talk about the bloody apparition or the bloody ghost that she would see in her bathtub. And she talked about this all the time. It was almost like she was obsessed with it. And so people called her, not Lucille, but Loose Wheel, because they thought she was a little bit touched. And so she had moved out, and Tim said, I'd really like to know if there's any truth to this story at all. He said, I doubt if you're going to find anything, but, just, so that I can put tenants' minds at ease, I'd really like to know. So I thought, okay, this is a pretty interesting challenge. I doubt if I'll find anything, but I began to research the house, and I found out some very interesting things about it. First of all, I discovered that the house was built very early in about 1864, 1865, one of the early houses in Virginia City, and it was built by a tailor by the name of Martin Lyon. And Martin Lyon had come from England, and he set up a tailor shop. He came with his wife and a couple of kids, and he set up this tailor shop and made quite a bit of money because miners always needed a good suit of clothes. So he had a lot of business, and he'd been in business for about a year when one night, on a Saturday night, he was walking home with all of his earnings in his pocket when thieves hit him over the head and left him for dead in the road, close to the house, actually. And it was in the middle of a blizzard, and the snow covered him up, and he didn't come home, and he didn't come home. And his wife must have gone crazy, worrying about him and wondering what had happened to him. And finally, after about 2 weeks, when the snow finally melted, they found him in the street not far from the house. So I'm thinking to myself, wow, maybe her grief imprinted on the walls or something. I didn't know anything about this kind of, ghosts or anything. And I'm thinking, well, what could that have to do with this bloody apparition in the bathtub? And it didn't seem to have anything to do with it, but it was an interesting piece of history for the house. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll go to the next residence. Well, Mrs. Lyon stayed in the house until, about the 1890s. She took in boarders. Nothing really happened in the house after Martin died. And then the next residence, a newlywed couple, they had a baby while they lived in the house, but nothing unusual happened to them. And then I looked at the third residence, and that was Frank and Amanda McKean. Well, if you know anything about Virginia City history, you might know that Frank McKean was a rather well-known character who was the bartender over many of the infamous bars in the early days. And he also then bought what's now the Fairweather Inn. And he was the proprietor of the Fairweather Inn and was quite an enterprising guy, and had a restaurant, and he had a billiard room, and he had hotel rooms, and he had a couple of rooms upstairs for the ladies that were reserved, you know, for that. And anyway, he ran a fairly well-known establishment. He married this woman by the name of Amanda, and both of them were over 40. Nobody thought either one of them would ever get married, and it totally floored the community when they came up as newlyweds. And they bought this property and moved in and had a very, very happy married life. But in 1918, Frank died of the Spanish flu epidemic. And, well, I'm thinking this isn't really getting me anywhere. Nothing happened in the bathroom. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to take it one more step, and I'm going to look to see what happened to Amanda. And so I went up to the cemetery in Virginia City, and I found the McKean, big granite tombstone, McKean on the front, and a place that said, you know, Frank and his date of death. And then there was a big blank space on the other side. But I could tell that there were two people buried there, you know how you can tell. And I thought to myself, this must be Amanda here, but why isn't her name on the tombstone? And so I looked into the death records, and I found her date of death, and I went to the newspaper, and I found the answer. 1923, there was a very graphic article that said, last Wednesday, Amanda McKean went to Butte, apparently for the purpose of buying a revolver. She came home to Virginia City, being despondent over the death of her husband, took the revolver, entered the bathroom of her house, and discharged a bullet in her brain. And that, if you ask me, explains the bloody apparition in the bathtub. And Marge Antalik, who lived in the house at the time and still owns the house, really appreciated my finding this story, because she tells me that they have never seen anything strange in the house, but her son's friends never wanted to go in that bathroom, and nobody could figure out why. And so even to this day, there are strange things that go on in that house. The water will turn on, the doors will open, you know, things do happen in a place and they make an impression, and perhaps that's a good example of that. Anyhow, that was the very first story that I ever wrote down, The Body in the Bathtub. And I think that is in the first book, in the Spirit Tailings book. So after that, I began to collect a number of stories. And this story happens to be one of the favorite ones of kids your age, so I'm glad I'm going to tell it townight. And this has to do with the town of Harlem, Montana. I don't know if you've ever been to Harlem, but Harlem, like many of the towns up on the High Line, was founded for the railroad. And Harlem was one of those places that had a lot of traffic back and forth. It was a stopping place. A lot of buildings were built down by the railroad tracks. Jeff Bickenhauser, who's a friend of mine, grew up in Harlem, and he told me this story that happened to him, and this is a true story. All my stories are true stories, but this is also a true story. In fact, I met his mother not too long ago, and she said, you know that story that you told about the Harlem Hotel? It's true, she said. So Jeff was telling me, you know, that he'd had this experience, and it really colored his life. He still says that he has nightmares about it. And so he grew up in Harlem, as I said, and at the time that he grew up in the 1960s, early 1970s, the buildings down by the railroad tracks were abandoned. And all of the kids in town were told, don't go down to the railroad tracks. So what do you think all the kids did? They went down and played down there by the railroad tracks in those empty buildings. But there was one building that everybody kind of stayed away from, and that was the Harlem Hotel. And kids were really leery about this because it actually looked like a big face. You know, it had windows in the front that were hollow with no glass, and it had a doorway that was long, the door had long been torn off, so it was this big gaping cavernous, you know, like that. And the kids, you know, thought to themselves, if I ever went in there, it's like entering a big mouth and I might not ever come out. It might swallow me. And so the kids kind of stayed away from the Harlem Hotel. But this one particular summer evening, Jeff and his friend Chris decided that they would go down by the railroad tracks and they would investigate the Harlem Hotel, and they would be very brave. And maybe some long ago visitor had left some treasure for them to find in one of the rooms. And so they had their dinner, and it was summertime, it was hot, and it was one of those long summer evenings with a lot of daylight. And the sun was maybe just beginning to set, and it was one of those sunsets that was very red. And they made their way down to the train tracks and came up to the hotel, and you know, they kind of looked at it and looked askance at each other, and neither one wanted to say that they were afraid. And so very bravely they stepped over the threshold. And there were, the plaster was coming off of the walls, the light was coming in through the slats. They could see the dust motes all over. Pigeons had been everywhere in the building. It was a mess. And everything was kind of bathed in this red glow from the setting sun. But there was not a piece of glass in any of the windows. All of the glass had long been broken out. And so they looked down the hallway. There was this very long, rather dark hallway with hotel rooms opening onto the hall. And they decided what they would do is make a systematic search of every room. And they started at the front and worked their way to the back, looking in every single room. And they found broken chairs, broken dressers, bed springs, some old bed frames, nothing very interesting. And they got to the very end of the hallway, and they were very disappointed that they hadn't found any treasure. And so at the end of the hallway, there was a stairway that went up and turned, and they looked up to see if they thought the second story was going to hold their weight. They thought it looked pretty safe, so they decided that they would go upstairs, and so they made their way up the stairway. And again, they found a long hallway with rooms opening onto it, and they decided, again, that they would make a systematic search of every single room. So they started at the top of the stairs and they made their way to the front of the building, looking in every single room. But unlike the downstairs, the rooms in the upstairs were empty. Nothing except some broken glass, lots of evidence of pigeons, and that's about it. So they looked in every single room and they made their way to the front of the building, and they got to the front of the building. And when they got to the very last room, they peeked in and they were very surprised to see that it wasn't empty. There was something in the room. And they looked at each other and they looked at the object and they knew what it was. They'd seen these on TV, but they'd never seen a real one. And what it was an old-fashioned wheelchair. You know, the kind that has a caned back and a caned seat and the wooden slats for your legs. And they looked at each other and they looked at that thing and they couldn't believe it. It looked brand new. And they looked at it, and they looked at each other, and they looked at it again, and all of a sudden their eyes bugged out and their mouths fell open, and they looked at each other again, and each had seen the same thing. And as they looked at it again, they could see the spokes in the wheel were beginning to move. And very, very, very slowly they could see that that wheelchair was beginning to creep towards them. And they took off running down the hall, and all they could hear was the pounding of the sneakers and the pounding of their hearts. And they got to the end of the hallway, and they thought they'd never get there. And they tumbled over each other all the way down to the bottom of the stairs. And they picked themselves up, and they ran towards the door, and they didn't think they'd ever make it. And they were running, 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 and thought they would never, ever get to the doorway. And they finally burst out into the evening. And as they got outside, Jeff told me that he looked behind him down that hallway, and what he saw is what gave him nightmares to this day. Because waiting at the very bottom of the stairway was the wheelchair. It was waiting for them. So another great story. Another great story has to do with Fort Assiniboine up by Havre. How many of you visited Fort Assiniboine? Some of you probably have made a trip up there. It's a really interesting place to visit. If you've never been up there, you should take a trip. But this story came to me from Tony Hagener, who is a former legislator from Hill County. And she told me that, this story came from a very elderly man who, shortly before he died, had a conversation with her and told her about this incident that happened to him. And it was something that he remembered from the time he was a young boy. He never forgot it. He remembered it for the rest of his life. And here's the story that he told her. Fort Assiniboine was built in 1879 in the aftermath of the Custer Battle. And it was built to protect the borders between the United States and Canada. And there was a huge number of people living there before the town of Havre was ever founded. There were probably 500, 600, 700 soldiers, and the officers' wives and families lived there too. And so there was a school, there was a church, there was a kind of a society all unto itself in the middle of nowhere. And the people made their own entertainment. They went ice sailing in the wintertime, and they went fishing in the summers, and they had bake sales and dances, and really had a wonderful little society all to themselves. But by 1911, the fort was closed. Havre by that time was on the railroad, and the fort wasn't needed anymore, and so it became a property that was used for many different purposes during the next decades. It was used as a refugee camp for homeless people during the 30s. It was used as a YMCA camp. It was used as a place for community events and for church retreats. All kinds of different events were held there. And in the late 1930s, this gentleman attended camp there, a YMCA camp. And he had an experience there, as I say, that he remembered for the rest of his life. He and his friends stayed in the bunks that were in the enlisted men's barracks. At that time, the barracks were a long, low building that covered quite a bit of space, just a long, skinny, low building. And the downstairs was full of bunk beds along the walls. And the upstairs was a place that was off limits to the kids. It was where all of the records of the fort were stored. And up there, you could see ledgers stacked up along the sides of the walls, and it made a corridor, a very long corridor that went the entire length of the building. And there was this narrow pathway with books and ledgers and things to either side. And this was a place that was irresistible to the kids. They were told, stay away from that place, you're not supposed to be up there. But the kids couldn't resist. And they would go up there and they would take those old ledgers, they would open them up, they would get a running start, and they would flop down and slide the whole length of that corridor. And it was like sledding in the wintertime. It was the most wonderful feeling of freedom and exhilaration. And if you've ever been down a hill on a sled, you know how that feels. The wind rushes past. And the kids just couldn't stay away from there. And they would always get caught. And they would have to peel potatoes for dinner, or they would have to do dishes, but they didn't care. It was worth it just for that slide down that long corridor. Well, kids went to bed at night and slept like rocks because, all day outside activities and that kind of thing. They were always very, very tired. But this one night, they all went to bed, and in the middle of the night, this young boy awakened, and he heard rustling sounds like paper. No footsteps, nothing, but this strange rustling sound overhead. So he snuck out of bed and he crept up the stairs. And when he got to the top of the stairs, he looked down this long corridor, and he could see at the far end, the moonlight was pooling in the one window. And sitting in this pool of moonlight was an old man, this old grizzled man. And he had long hair that was covering his face, so you couldn't see his features. And he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, and he had one of those ledger books, or some kind of book, open in his lap. Not a breath of wind ever anywhere. Nothing stirred. There was no noise, just the sound of the pages turning. And he could see, the little boy could see the pages turning very slowly in this ledger, whatever it was. And one by one, the pages would turn. Well, he was terrified, and so he backed down the stairs as quietly as he could. And he got down to his bunk and he nudged his buddy. And he made his buddy wake up and he said, you'll never guess what I saw upstairs. Come with me. So the two of them, like thieves in the night, crept up the stairs again. And they got to the top of the stairs and they both saw the grizzled old man at the end of the corridor, sitting cross-legged with his ledger book open in his lap and the pages just turning, turning, turning. So they went back down to their beds and they lay there. Neither one of them slept a wink, and they stared at the stairway all night long to see who would come down, and nobody did. And so when everyone was up in the morning, they kind of hung back and waited for an opportunity and raced up the stairs to check to see if the man was still there. Nobody was there. Nothing was out of place. And so after that, the boy thought about that incident, and he never could get it out of his mind, and he thought about it as he grew up. He thought about it. And he thought about it all the time. And in 1954, those barracks burned down, and nothing was left but a big blanket of ashes and some foundations. And there was nothing left there. And he always in his mind's eye pictured the ruins of that building and that old man who he had come to the conclusion must have been an old soldier who was looking for something that he couldn't find. And he always pictured that old man sifting through the ashes of the old burned out building, a ghost within a ghost. Now this isn't so much a story as it is an incident that I participated in that was kind of interesting. And I thought I would share it with you because it's kind of close proximity. How many of you visited Boulder Hot Springs? So, you know, Boulder Hot Springs, the folks there have a story about Simone, their ghost. And I've done some research and I've never been able to determine if there really is a Simone. When people come and go in a hotel like that, many people, since the 19th century have come and gone in that hotel. So it's very hard to say who an entity might be. I have no doubt that they, have a ghost in that particular wing of the hotel. But this incident that happened is something quite different. There's a fellow here in town by the name of Patrick Marsalik, who is a licensed hypnotherapist. And some years ago, he and I teamed up several different times, and he did a series of intuitive workshops for people who wanted to practice their intuitive skills. And a lot of people have very, very finely tuned intuition. I'm not sure you would call them psychic exactly, but maybe you could, I don't know. Anyway, he advertised them, and about 14 people gathered at Boulder Hot Springs for this particular seminar. And the idea was to let them roam around, get the impressions and the vibes of the place. Then we would meet in a central location, and each person, one by one, would tell their impressions. And I got to be there because, as a historian, I actually knew the real history of the building. And then the idea is to see if any of their impressions matched the history that we knew about the building. So this particular night, it was pitch dark, and the nice managers let us have the run of the closed wing. There's one wing that is in terrible disrepair that they don't use, and it's closed off. But this particular night, we had the run of this wing, and it was really very exciting because nobody gets to go in there. And so the staff took us up, and we all had flashlights, and we roamed around in the rooms for about an hour. It was very cold, very, very dark. Nobody talked. That was the rule. You couldn't talk to your, to anybody. And so we, picked up the vibes. Well, I didn't because I'm not intuitive, but they picked up the vibes of the wing. And after about an hour, we went back downstairs and we gathered on the landing of the stairway that goes up to this locked wing. And everyone sat around and people gave their impressions. Most of the group was women, but there were a few men. And the men in this group, there were maybe 3 or 4 of them, and they all said that they felt a female presence in these rooms, and that whoever it was plucking at their shirts, at their jackets, trying to get them to stay, didn't want them to leave. And they had the impression that these were ladies of the evening. And it's true that according to local lore, that wing was inhabited by ladies of the evening at some time or other in its history. I've never been able to actually substantiate that. But anyway, that was the impression of these various guys. But then almost everybody else had a totally different experience. And almost everyone else said that they heard balls bouncing down the hallway, that they could hear children running up and down the corridor, and that they could hear children's laughter. And what nobody knew but me was that during the 1930s, in 1935, when Helena experienced the earthquakes, October 18th and 31st, this is the anniversary, this month is the anniversary of those really devastating earthquakes. St. Joseph's Children's Home was devastated. And it was uninhabitable for about 1.5 years, 2 years. And the children from that orphanage were allowed to live in that wing of the hot springs until the orphanage was repaired. So that was kind of an interesting thing that happened. And then the last person, when it came to the last person to stand up and tell her impressions, she had been sitting in a corner of this landing. This is a wooden stairway, not carpeted, but wooden. And she was kind of curled up in the corner of this landing. And she'd been there, ever since the first person started to talk, and she'd hardly moved. And so she got up, she kind of unfolded herself, and she got up and she stretched. And she said, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just feel like I'm a cat and I need to stretch. And the staff person that was standing there turned white. And she said, oh my goodness. She said, in that corner on the landing, that's where our elderly cat's favorite place to sleep was. And she died right there last week. People call me oftentimes, or they call the librarian, they ask questions, and the librarians are pretty sensitive, and they always refer those kind of questionable questions to me as the ghost person. And one day, a lady called the library, wanted to know, she was very upset, and she wanted to know how she could research her property out in Jefferson County. And there was something else about her voice that told the librarian that she wanted to talk to somebody about something else. They said, well, you better talk to Ellen, maybe she can help you. So I get on the phone, and she kind of hems and haws around, and she says, I'd like to know what was previously on this property because we built this new house. And she said, I'm afraid that my son, who's about 4, is going to become afraid of living in the house. I'm thinking, oh, this must be good. And so I said, well, why do you think that? And she said, well, a few things have happened. Well, what's happened? And she just didn't want to tell me. And so finally she said, we've done some research and we found out that on this property there was kind of a hippie commune in the 50s or 60s. Or probably in the 60s, and she said, we have a few foundations and things, but she said there's also this abandoned schoolhouse that's down the road, and it's all boarded up and hasn't been used, I don't know, she said, I don't know when, but she said, I'm wondering if that might have something to do with what's happening in my house. And so I said, well, why don't you just tell me what's happening. And she said, well, she said, my husband has been hearing children playing out in the yard. And she said, you know, we've just moved into this house, it's a brand new, but he's been hearing these children, and he'll look out the window and there's nobody out there. But she said yesterday he heard the voices again, and he looked out the kitchen window and he saw these two little boys, and they were kind of oddly dressed, and they were playing out in the yard. So he stepped out the back door to talk to them. And as he did that, they looked up and saw him, and they scampered off into the woods and down this ravine. But they never came out. And so he got really worried about these little boys, and you know, maybe that they were lost or something. And so he called all the neighbors he could think of, and they didn't have any near neighbors, but he called everybody he could think of along the road to see if they had visiting family or kids, and nobody did. And so he was just very concerned about these kids, but there wasn't anything he could do. So they went to bed that night. And then she told me that she awakened in the middle of the night, and she saw these two little boys standing at the foot of her bed. And she said to me, what should I do? I don't know. I said if it were me, I would tell those boys, this is not your house, you're not allowed to play here. And you know, that was the best advice I could give her. And she never called back, so I don't know what happened. But that would be quite a frightening thing to happen. On the other hand, you know, sometimes experiences can be very spiritual, really. Joyce Walker, again, was a person that I talked to on the phone, and she told me about an experience that is just briefly written up in Montana Chillers. Her experience was that she and her father liked to go hunting when she was younger. And one day they were hunting in a farmer's field, and they had permission to hunt in this area. The farmer had taken his livestock and moved it to another place so that they could hunt there, and they were hunting birds. And the pasture was kind of ringed with bushes, and so they were flushing out birds. And her dad had gone back to the car to do something with the gun. And she was walking in the middle of the field, and there was this little lean-to, you know, one of those little shelters that gets the horses or the cows out of the sun or out of the rain. And it was just a little 3 sides open, the back was closed off. And so she began to walk around this little lean-to, and all of a sudden she heard behind her what she was sure was a horse. To hear his hooves stamping the ground. She could hear his tail swishing. She could hear him breathing and snorting. And she knew he was back there. And she turned around, and there was nothing there. And so she got kind of spooked, and she went back to the car, and she told her dad what had happened. And he said, well, let's go walk around, you know, a little more. So they come back to this little lean-to, and they walk around, and there at the back of the lean-to was the skeleton of a horse. And she said to me, you know, it was like the horse had died and nobody knew that it was there. And I felt lucky that I had been the one that found it, because I could tell someone that it was there. I could tell the rancher, the farmer, that it was there. And she said, maybe that will, you know, free its spirit. But animals have spirits like that too. And I think it's a really lovely little lesson that, you know, we really need to be sensitive to those kinds of things. One little thing that happened that I think is one of the creepiest things I've ever heard. I was doing a program some years ago in Plentywood. I had a great time, and afterwards several people came up to tell me stories. And one of them was a young woman by the name of Jennifer Polk. And she told me that she had grown up in a house in Plentywood. Her father was a minister, and throughout her childhood she had been bothered by these very, very scary dreams. And she didn't know if they were dreams or if it was really a ghost that was coming to her at night. And she told me that it was this woman, and it was always the same woman. And this woman would appear at the side of her bed, and she would bend over her, and she would whisper in her ear, and she would say, "Come play with me, come play with me." I think that's very creepy. So she went away to school. she went away to school, and when she came back for her first holiday, she was again sleeping in her bed, had completely forgotten about these experiences that she'd had as a child, and again she dreamed about this woman. And again the woman bent over her and whispered in her ear, "Come play with me." And being a little bit older, she turned around and said, "Go away and leave me alone." And that's the last she ever had the woman visit her. Another very favorite story of kids your age has to do with Annabelle Richards' house. How many of you know Annabelle Richards? Some of you probably know her. You did? Did you live in that house? You live in it now. Well, maybe I shouldn't tell this story then, huh? And you know, and it's maybe you've heard me tell it before, I don't know. But it's interesting because there's a long story about Annabelle Richards' house in Beyond Spirit Tailings. I think it's in Beyond, and maybe it's in Spirit Tailings in the first book. But it's funny because once stories are published, then other things, you know, come out. And the story has to do with Annabelle and how she lived in this house for many years, raised her kids there, and she absolutely loved this house, and she loved especially the spirit that was in the house. She had made friends with it. It was a female spirit, and she felt very comfortable there. She just really, it was the one thing that she loved about that house. She and her husband went to Washington, D.C. He was the attaché for Senator Melcher for about 7 years. And in the interim, they rented the house to a number of tenants, and they had a really hard time keeping tenants there. And finally, when they came back, she stepped inside that house, and she knew that what she had loved about the house wasn't there anymore. And finally, the last tenant admitted that they had been so afraid of whatever it was in the house that they had called their minister and had the house blessed, and the spirit was gone. But after the story was written, the story is much longer than that, but after the story was written, I heard about one of the tenants and what happened to her and her daughter. And this is what happened to her when she lived in the house. She was a single mother, had a young daughter, maybe 4 or 5, and the daughter had the room on the landing. You know which room that is, right? Do you know about this story? No. The daughter had the room on the landing, and so the mom had removed the doorknob from the door because she was afraid that little girl could lock herself in and not be able to get out. So there was a hole in the door where the doorknob used to be. And the little girl had a cat, and this cat always slept curled up next to her stomach, you know. And this one particular night, she went to bed, and the cat was right there. But the little girl then awakened in the middle of the night, and the cat wasn't there. And this was unheard of. The cat always stayed there all night long. And she awakened, and the cat was gone, and she looked around as her eyes adjusted to the dark, and she looked around, and finally she couldn't find the cat. And finally she looked to the foot of her bed, and there she saw the cat sitting at the foot of the bed. And the cat was staring at something, and the cat's eyes were getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally she knew that she was going to have to look to see what this cat was looking at, and she didn't want to. So it took all the courage she could muster to follow her cat's gaze. And when she saw what the cat was looking at, it gave her nightmares for years to come. Because sticking through the hole where the doorknob used to be was a finger, and it was pointing directly at her. You better put the doorknob back in the door if you don't. Also at that little library in Plentywood where I got the story from Jennifer Polk, there was a rancher there who said, "Well, I have a story I want to tell you." And he proceeded to tell me about when he was a kid in the 30s, his family had bought a brand new car. A lot of people came into a little bit of money during the New Deal, spent their money on cars, and his family was no exception, but they had no electricity in their house. They had this brand new car, and they used to love to go visit the neighbors and show it off and drive it in the evenings and the summers. And But then when they came home, they had a very long driveway, and they'd come up the driveway, and the house would be all dark, and the kids would have to draw straws to see who would have to go in and light the lantern. And so one night they had been out visiting. It was pretty late, and they came home, and it was very dark, and they drove up the driveway. And as they parked in front of the house, they looked up to the third story, and they saw something white in the window. And everyone was terrified because it was moving a bit back and forth like this. And it looked like a figure of a woman or a man or some human figure just standing there in the window, kind of swaying like this. And so they had to draw straws to see who would go in and light the lights. And of course, this guy, who was a little tyke at that time, knew he was going to get the short straw, and sure enough, he did. And so he said he was so terrified. He was never so terrified in all his life. He went into the house, and he took the lantern, and his fingers were shaking, and he lit it. And his father had told him, you go up to the attic and find out what that is. And he knew he had to go up and do it, or he would get a whipping. And so he said he delayed as long as he could, and finally he took the lantern, and he went up the first story and stopped on the second story, and he was just shaking. He was so scared, and he went up the second flight of stairs up to the attic, and there was a door there, and he flung the door open. There he saw that in the wintertime his mother had done the laundry and hung the long johns out, and she'd forgotten a pair, and they were hanging in the window on a hanger, swaying in the wind. So, you know, every community, I think every community has a hitchhiker story. And did you know that Helena has a hitchhiker story too? And this, you know, I think Helena's story is more credible than other ones that I've read, because usually they're all pretty much the same, and they never have any resolution or anything. But this particular story, and if the person who called me and told it to me here's this, please call me, because I would really like to talk with you about it a little bit more. But one day this guy called me and said that, you know, he had this story he wanted to tell me. And he said that there was, probably some of you remember the Man in the Brown Derby. Do you remember the Man in the Brown Derby, Al Gaskill, who for, maybe 30 years wrote a column in the Independent Record called The Man in the Brown Derby. From the 40s, 50s, 60s, he wrote this column. Well, this guy told me that he had always admired Al Gaskill's columns, and he was a nurse. The man who had called me was a nurse at the VA hospital, and happened to have Al Gaskill as a patient during Al's last illness. And he was thrilled to meet this guy, because as a kid he had always loved this column and had read it faithfully. And so he introduced himself and said, "Mr. Gaskill, I'm so glad to meet you. You know, I've really admired your column." And so he said, "So do you have a favorite column? Which one was your favorite one?" And he said, "Well, yeah, you know, my most favorite one is about the hitchhiker over McDonald Pass. And I have searched and searched for this column, and I haven't been able to find it. I have no doubt that it does exist, and one day I will find it." But the story goes something like this, that Al Gaskill wrote in this column that there was a guy who was coming home from Missoula late at night, and he had to come across McDonald Pass. It was in the 60s, early 60s. And he came across McDonald as he was headed over the pass, just before you go up the hill there on the Elliston side. He stopped to get out and walk around for a few minutes, because he was getting kind of tired. And so he was walking around this little pullout where there was one of those white crosses. And he got in the car, and he looked in his rearview mirror, and there was someone sitting in the back seat. And it was this young girl, and she said, "Could I please have a ride over to Helena?" And he said, "Well, what are you doing in my car?" And she said, "Well, I'm supposed to meet friends over at the Civic Center. I'm supposed to go to this dance, and I need a way to get there. Please take me." And, well, what could he do? It's, out in the middle of nowhere. And so he said, "Well, okay." And so he drives over the pass, and presumably she's in the back seat. And he thought as he drove over the pass, the car was acting kind of funny, kind of pulling to the right. and he thought maybe something was wrong with his tires, and he was, driving pretty carefully. So he got over to the other side of the pass, and it got down to the bottom of the mountain there, and he looked in his rear view mirror, and there was nobody there. So he came into Helena. On his way into Helena, he said he stopped at the Night Owl Lounge, had a couple of stiff belts, went home, and the next morning he called a friend who worked for the highway department and said, could you do a check and see if you can find out who that white cross there over on the Elliston side of the pass is commemorating? It was a new cross, apparently. And so his friend called him back and said, well, there was a carload of teenagers that were headed to the Civic Center to a dance, and there was an accident, and one of the girls was killed. So that was the column, and this young man then said, Mr. Gaskell, I've always really admired that column. That was my favorite one. And Al looked at him and he said, I could have lost my job over that column. I had to be really, really careful in the way that I wrote that, because he said, I can tell you that it's a true story because it happened to me. Let's see. We've got a few minutes left here. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a writer from Great Falls by the name of Tom Donovan. He wrote 2 books. Each one is about like this, Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Hanging Around Big Sky. And it's all of the legal hangings and illegal hangings that ever occurred in Montana. And believe me, there are a lot of them. I mean, the volumes are he did a lot of research, and it's all the meticulous details about every single hanging that's ever occurred in Montana. Well, you have to have an interesting personality to write a book like that, and he is a very interesting guy. And one day we were sitting at a book signing together, and he said to me, he said, neither one of us were selling any books, and so he said, I have this story that I want to tell you about something that happened to me when I was a kid. And he said, you're welcome to use it if you want to. So I've since told this story many, many times. It's one of my favorite ones. So he told me that he grew up in Missoula. And when he was about 16, he and his friends had all gotten their driver's licenses, and they thought they were real hot stuff, And they loved to go out in the hills and hunt on the weekends and camp. And so this one particular Friday afternoon, they never planned anything ahead. Boys don't do that. And so this one Friday afternoon, it was about 4 o'clock, and they all met. And the 4 of them decided that the weather is supposed to be really good. It'd be a great opportunity to throw stuff in the family station wagon and drive out into the hills and have a nice weekend of camping and hunting. So it was getting dark by the time they got everything together, and they drove out of Missoula, and they could see the lights beginning to come on behind them, and they drove up into the hills, and they drove and they drove and they drove and they drove on this gravel road, and they drove and they drove and they drove, and finally it was getting pretty dark, and they decided they had better pull over and find a place to camp. So they pulled off the road. They really had no idea where they were. And they got out of the car to see if they could find a suitable place to make a fire and put their bedrolls. And they came to this little clearing just off the road, and they thought they had found the perfect camping place, because the grass was very, very thick carpet there, no rocks anywhere. And they thought, wow, we're going to have a great night's sleep tonight. So they got their stuff out of the car, they built a little fire, they had a little bit to eat, crawled into their sleeping bags, and all 4 of them promptly went to sleep. But right at midnight, all 4 of them awakened at exactly the same moment. And they sat bolt upright in their sleeping bags. And everyone was quiet, and they looked around. They could see each other in the glow of the campfire. And one of them said, "Did you hear that?" And the others, yeah, they had heard it. And they listened. These boys were raised in southwestern Montana. They knew what it was. It was the sound of a miner's pick hitting rock. And you know how that sounds? Sometimes the miner's pick will hit the rock and it will ring. And this was coming from somewhere deep under the earth beneath them. And they said, what is a miner doing at midnight mining? In this cold weather, this is ridiculous. Why would somebody be doing that? We better go find him. So they crawled out of their sleeping bags, put on their coats, took their flashlights, and they began to search the countryside to see if they could find the access to this tunnel or whatever it was. And they could see right away that this was a place that had been extensively mined, because there were shafts, mining shafts, all over the place. And they began to search around, and they would find these shafts, and they would listen, and no, it wasn't coming from that one. No, it wasn't coming from that one. And finally, they got to this one where they could hear the sounds coming from it. And, you know, you should never, ever, ever do this. But they were compelled somehow to go down and investigate. And this was a rather large mining shaft, and there was a ladder leading down. And so the first one started down, and then the second one, and then the third one, and then the fourth one, and they were all in a line. And there was water running down the sides of this mine shaft, and it was muddy, and they could hear the miner hitting the rock with his pick. And they could hear that steady, rhythmic pick ring. It was almost like a song. And they could also hear the dripping of the water, drip, 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 as it hit a puddle at the bottom of the ladder. And so they're going down, 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 down. And finally, the first boy's foot hit that puddle of water, and the miner's picking sound stopped. And there was no sound except for the drip, drip, drip of the water hitting the puddle. And they got really spooked. We better get out of here. And so they hightailed it back up the ladder. They couldn't tell which way the sound had been coming from anyway, and there were mining tunnels in all directions. And so they hightailed it back up the ladder and out, back to their campsite, crawled back into their sleeping bags, and talked about what they had just experienced. And they couldn't explain it. They couldn't figure out what in the heck that might have been about. And so they tried to go to sleep. None of them could sleep a wink. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited for it to get light. And finally, when the first little rosy fingers of dawn began to show, they said, let's get out of here. So they crawled out of their sleeping bags, they put out the fire, they gathered up all their stuff and threw it in the station wagon. And as they did that, it was just beginning to get light, and they could see up in the distance the outlines of buildings. And they could see a sign to the side of the road that said that they had parked just outside the town, the ghost town of Coloma. And so they went back to make sure that they had gotten everything from their campsite, and it was just now getting light. And as they got back to the campsite to make sure the fire was out, they realized with horror what they had done. They had camped in the cemetery between Garnet and Coloma, and they had actually put their sleeping bags in the depressions where the graves were, and they had literally been sleeping with the dead of Coloma. Okay, let's see, maybe I'll do one more, and then we'll repair to the bookstore. This story has a personal experience at the end. And how many of you have visited Nevada City? So you know that Charles Bovee sort of created that town there. And I have lots and lots of stories about Virginia City and Nevada City, but this one is, this is sort of a Halloween story, so it's kind of appropriate, at least the end of it is. So the Nevada City Hotel is one of those places that is built of pieces and parts of other things. And the front part of it was the stage stop at Salisbury, which was not too far away. So it is an authentic stage stop, and it's 2 stories high. There are 2 hotel rooms on the upper story, and there's a ladies' parlor on one side and a saloon on the other side, and then the little lobby is in the center. The back portion, where most of the guest rooms are, was from the Canyon Lodge at Yellowstone Park, and it was the dormitory for employees, and that's what today are the hotel rooms, except for the 2 hotel rooms of the old stage stop, and you can also stay in those. But in 2001, there was a global stage production company that wanted to film a scene in the saloon part of the Nevada City Hotel. And they had to do it, you know, when the tourist season is over and no one is there. There's no power in Nevada City in the wintertime. This was February. It's very, very, very cold, one of the coldest nights of the year. And they were filming this at night. And there were about 50 extras from the town, from Ennis and from Virginia City, that had been hired to fill up this saloon. So it was very crowded. And the director said, okay, so I want it to be very, very quiet in here, and we're going to shoot this scene, and I'm going to say, lights, camera, action. And when I say action, I want everyone to hold their breath because I don't want any sound. Okay, so everybody is ready, and he goes, lights, camera, action. 1, 2, 3. On 3, everyone holds their breath. And they begin to hear creaking overhead. And pretty soon they can hear very distinct clomp, clomp, clomp. Somebody's up there, very agitated, pacing back and forth. Cut, 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 says the director. And John Ellingson, who some of you probably know, at that point was working for the state. He had all the keys, so he and another guy ran upstairs to see who's up in room number 7, right overhead. And they opened the door, and there's nobody in there. All the furniture is covered up and stuff. And so he comes back down and says, you know, there's nobody up there. So they try it again. Lights, camera, action, 1, 2, 3. Everybody takes a deep breath. Same thing. Stomping overhead, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, they had to go ahead and film it and dub the sound out. And they even captured the sound on the film. And so I do tours in the Nevada City Hotel. The weekend before Halloween, they have a big event on the Friday and Saturday before Halloween. It was about 5 years, maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I had done 6 or 7 tours, haunted tours of Nevada City, and we always end up in the Nevada City Hotel. And I take the folks into the saloon, and I tell them that story, and I tell them to hold their breath and see if they can hear the footsteps. And so we had done that, and this was the last tour of the evening. It was about 9 o'clock. It's so dark there, you can't believe it. My flashlight died. It was a brand new flashlight. Somehow or other, I always have problems with something sucking out the energy of my flashlights. So somebody else had a flashlight, and there were a number of kids that were on this tour, and they wanted to go upstairs. I didn't particularly want to go upstairs, but I said, well, okay, we'll go upstairs. I had the keys. So we go up to the second floor of this old stage stop, and we go to room number 7, which is the room where they had heard the footsteps, and I unlock the door. The door swings open, and all of this furniture's covered up. You know, it looks really creepy, but there's, you know, nothing in there. They wandered around there for a few minutes and then came out, and they said, well, can we see the other room, the room across the hall, the other room of the stage stop? And I said, well, okay. And so I took the key. I had, all the people were behind me, pressing up against me, and there were a couple of little boys on either side of me, about your age. And I opened the door, and as I opened it, like, you don't have to turn the knob, the door will just swing open. So I unlocked it, and the door swings open. As the door swings open, the 2 boys to either side of me clutched my jacket. And they said, did you hear that? Did you hear that? We all heard footsteps coming from underneath the bed. And that's true. And the 2 boys behind me and the parents behind me there, let's get out of here. And that is a true story. And I'm going to quit now, and we're going to go to the bookstore. If you guys have questions, I'll be in there. You can ask me questions, and we can continue the conversation.